Hello, everybody, and welcome to the second webinar on our conservation series, where we're going to be talking about all of the work that we're doing with forest systems. I am delighted to have on our panelists a fantastic selection, including an offline recorded video from our program in São Tomé Príncipe. We are going to start with Katie Sims, who works with the forest program at BirdLife, but we will then have Gacheru from Nature Kenya, Alice from SAVE Brasil, BirdLife in Brazil, and we will have the video from Marquínha coming from São Tomé and Príncipe. We're going to try to keep the presentations to a shorter period of time so we can have more time for discussion. For those of you who were on our first webinar about the bird trade in Asia, thank you so much for joining us. You may have seen and heard that we are keeping recordings of these webinars so you can see them and share them with your colleagues and friends. And that will be the same thing from this one. So thanks so much for joining us. And without further ado, let me pass on the floor to Katie.
Hi there. Hey, thank you, Patricia. It's great to be here today. And we actually wanted to try and do something quite special with you and take you on a bit of a journey into tropical forest landscapes around the world and the places that BirdLife works. So we start briefly by taking you to the Gola rainforest in Sierra Leone. We recommend that you close your eyes and turn up the volume loudly to be able to take in this full experience. So please take a listen to this. So that was just a few minutes of forest sounds from Gola Rainforest, Sierra Leone. And this is just one of the forests that are a global priority landscape for BirdLife. And this means they are home to endangered species, vast biodiversity, and they are some of the most important ecosystems on the planet, which provide the conditions for food to grow, the climate to remain stable. They are even our water source. And as we know, we are suffering the effects of not protecting our forests. Here are the stats. A quarter of our tropical forests have been lost since 1950, and we are losing over 18 million acres annually, and tropical forest is the most at threat. So we want to keep our forests standing and expanding because it is a key part of the climate solution. And here at BirdLife, we are a global program working with local partners to get to the heart of the threats to tropical forest landscapes and change their future for everyone. But what is a landscape, and why and how is a landscape threatened? We have an animation to show you now.
Landscapes don't just consist of mountains, forest, wildlife and people. They are formed by the decisions people make. Here, we'll choose unsustainable farming. The production of cash crops can harm the landscape. It's complex. Local, national and global forces influence decisions, and often profits don't benefit rural communities. Weather can be unpredictable, markets fluctuate. And the people and wildlife that rely on the landscape suffer over time. People may resort to illegal activities. One decision can have many knock-on effects. If natural systems fail, food systems fail too. So let's make a different choice. Now we'll choose forest-positive farming. Think of tree crops grown in the shade of forest. Given the right incentives, things can change. Incentives drive decisions. People can turn their skills to forest-positive solutions and can help connect and restore forest. Winner! Well-managed landscapes meet the needs of the present without compromising the future. They can help maintain a stable climate, conserve species, and produce food. It's linked to every supermarket purchase, every politician we elect, every business we invest in. We need to value our natural spaces in the long term. Invest positively in the environment and encourage innovation, so that both people and forests can thrive. The BirdLife Accelerator is investing in bold, sustainable solutions for tropical forest landscapes around the world. What's your next decision?
So that's our animation, and if, as the animation says, landscapes are shaped by decisions and incentives, then we want to explore with you today those positive incentives and solutions that we can use to change the future of these landscapes. So let's delve more into our initiative called the Forest Landscape Sustainability Accelerator. And through the Accelerator, we are making direct investments in sustainable and nature-based solutions for forests. And on the call with us today, as you can see, are some of our landscape leaders. They are participants in the Accelerator, and collectively, they have decades of experience of protecting forests, its wildlife, and the people who live around the forest. And they know the realities of these forests. And we're betting that they can change the game for forest conservation and keep forests standing and expanding with new ideas. Now, to explain a bit about the Accelerator, it's based on a tech startup model you might see in Silicon Valley. And with the support from Hempel Foundation and Google, we have been able to take the best ideas from front-running landscapes and support landscape leaders to accelerate. We need long-term solutions now, so acceleration is the key. And the solutions can be varied. They use an economic model that promotes conservation instead of unsustainable extraction from forests. And we are learning a lot and seeing big changes already through the Accelerator. So before you make any more decisions today, I'm going to invite the landscape leaders to tell you about their work with the Accelerator and their solutions to keep forests standing and expanding, which is a true climate change solution. And don't forget to ask your questions by typing in the Q&A box throughout, and we'll answer at the end. But let's visit our landscape leaders. And first we're going to Kenya, to Paul Gacheru, who is a wildlife biologist who saw a solution in restoring forest to protect water supply. And Gacheru and his team are challenging companies in the growing capital of Nairobi to take responsibility for this conservation action that will shore up water supply to millions of people. as well as the future of the company's operations. So Gacheru will explain more. Over to you, Gacheru.
Thank you, Katie, and welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Kenya and to my landscape, Mount Kenya Forest. This is Kenya's largest forest, which supports 2 major river basins, and it's also an important area for biodiversity. And most importantly, the water that flows out of Mount Kenya supports over 95% of Kenya's hydroelectric power generation, and also drinking water for over 8 million people in our country, and also 2 million hectares of irrigation for crops within our country. But over the past years, between 2000 and 2018, we have recorded forest loss of over 26%, which has resulted mainly because of competing demands for fuel wood and also agriculture and unregulated forest product extraction. And this has resulted into increase in sedimentation into the rivers that flow out of the forest. Case in point, local companies have recorded over 60% increase in water treatment cost between 2010 and 2018, and also hydroelectric power dams have reported reduction of reservoir capacities of between 10 and 15%. This by itself has a huge negative impact to our economy and also to the well-being of the local community. With this background, Nature Kenya has embarked on a mission to restore Mount Kenya Forest 1 hectare at a time, working in collaboration with the local community groups who are based next and living adjacent to the forest. Here, let me show you some footage of the areas that we are working and also the communities that you're working with. You can see on your screen local community groups and people who have been trained to propagate both indigenous, exotic tree seedlings for on-farm tree growing and also for forest restoration. And also, these tree seedlings provide also an alternative business for the community. In 2019 alone, the community earned over $190,000 from the sale of tree seedlings alone. So by this, it provides an incentive for the community to engage in forest restoration, as they also make a living out of it. As part of the commitment, the community have agreed that they will participate actively in forest restoration, while we as Nature Kenya and other partners have committed to provide support, both technical, equipment, and also training of the community groups to participate in forest restoration. As including this, our national government, through Kenya Forest Service, have identified sites where these tree seedlings would be grown within the forest. And our support does not end only at planting a tree, because planting a tree does not mean that the tree will survive, but we provide also post-planting support, in which we provide to the community to provide weeding, to weed, to maintain the sites that they have planted the trees, which has resulted to increased survival rate of the tree seedlings that have been grown in the forest of between 80 and 95%. This by itself is an exceptional result that we have modeled within our landscape in Mount Kenya. I would like to demonstrate to you using satellite imagery of how forests are being established within the mountain using our model. It has taken a while for us to actually establish this model that we know now works. In 2010, Nature Kenya, together with the local community and Kenya Forest Service, adopted a small portion of land within Mount Kenya Forest, where we wanted to pilot this model of forest restoration. And you can see on your screen, the area with the red boundary is the area that Nature Kenya, together with local communities, and started engaging in forest restoration. And you can see from there, by 2014, 2015, we started planting the trees. And in 2016, you can see that the trees were able to establish roots. And we continued on, and in 2019, you can actually see the forest has fully established. And with this model, we are able to see that it's not only about planting a tree or putting a tree into the ground, but there's a post-care that is required for this forest to establish. So forest restoration by itself, we have recorded that has shown positive impact on biodiversity. We have been monitoring these sites, and you have seen forest specialist species coming back to these areas. And we use this as an indicator to show that this area that we are restoring is good for biodiversity and also restoring vital ecosystem services through the action that we are supporting the local communities to engage in. The task ahead on Mount Kenya forests is huge and no one can accomplish it alone. We have supported, with the support of partners, to develop a forest restoration strategy that is helping coordinate people on the ground in forest restoration. We have also noted, as Katie mentioned earlier, a huge gap on private sector engagement. And with support from partners like the Darwin Initiative, BirdLife International, we have developed a business case for forest restoration, which we are marketing to these companies to show reason why forest restoration equates to business sustainability. Because if there's no water flowing from the forest, the businesses would reduce their would have no raw materials for their production. So far, we have restored 1,500 hectares of forest to date, and we still have a huge amount of areas that we require forest restoration, and we have targeted 6,200 hectares, which are in urgent need of forest restoration within Mount Kenya forest. And with your support, we can achieve this goal moving forward. Thank you very much.
Oh, wow. Thank you, Gacheru. I think, as you can see, an investment in Gacheru and his team's work is not just an investment in a single project. It's an investment in a sustainable mechanism. And this mechanism is successful for the community. It shows amazing results by encouraging biodiversity back to these newly forested areas. And it's a win-win for the businesses involved who will actually save money with nature-based solutions. And this is exactly what we're looking for through the Accelerator. And Gacheru and his team have just applied for their first Accelerator seed grant. And with this seed grant, they can grow this idea and accelerate with more communities and businesses. So we wish them a lot of success. Just a reminder to keep your questions coming for our landscape leaders. And by the way, if you want to see that amazing reforestation sequence again from Gacheru, just let us know. We can show you again afterwards. And we are going now to the other side of the African continent, to a small but mighty set of islands, which is São Tomé and Príncipe, with Marquínha, a field officer for the programme, who works closely with communities to find alternative livelihood opportunities so that they benefit from conservation. And they are now just starting to explore how to accelerate these ideas for the whole landscape. And unfortunately, she couldn't join us live. The internet connection is unstable, but she did film something for us, which I will play now.
Hi everyone, my name is Marquínha Martins. I am field officer for BirdLife in São Tomé. Do you know where São Tomé and Príncipe is? São Tomé and Príncipe is a small set of islands in the Gulf of Guinea, off the coast of Gabon in Africa. Did you also know that more than 75% of biodiversity depend on forests, and the forests are essential for life on Earth. And in São Tomé, despite the small size of our island, it's vital because our tropical climate and mountainous landscape, as well as the geographical location and isolation from the African continent, have given us the rise to remarkable biodiversity in our country. Most of this biodiversity exists in our Obo Natural Park, where I work. Our Obo Natural Park covers around 1/3 of the island and includes most of our remaining native forests. Did you also know that worldwide 50% of deforestation is due to agriculture? And in São Tomé is no exception. The human pressure due to lack of opportunity and poverty is leading to logging and agriculture, having a strong impact on forest ecosystem and on the endemic animals and plants. So we BirdLife in São Tomé are working to secure effective management of the protected areas along with mainstreaming biodiversity into sectorial activities. This means we want vital forests and its wildlife to be a focus for all sectors, from business to government, we are advocating for conservation actions, supporting education of forest communities, and build capacities in rural areas. We need to make sure that conservation benefits rural people. We are finding sustainable solutions to help to provide a livelihood alternative so that people can thrive in forest landscapes. We are just starting on this journey, and there's a lot of potential to work on. New models for sustainable conservation and finance, for instance. We are also starting now with the Accelerator program, and it has been very interesting for us to learn more from others in the program and hear about innovative initiatives for forest biodiversity conservation that has been developed, as that this sharing of information and experience will enable all of us to perfect our approaches in the future.
So a short message there from Marquínha, and I don't know about you, but I can't wait to hear more from that team and as they progress with their goals to ensure that conservation benefits rural communities. And one thing for me is really clear, is that they aim to see an evolution in biodiversity conservation from a mosaic of donor-driven projects to a coherent, consistent program focused on the enabling conditions for conservation. And one thing that Marquínha did mention to me is that they plan to do a butterfly farm and a butterfly sanctuary, which will be a tourist attraction. So let's hope we can visit either online or in person maybe one day in the future. And clearly, you can see just as wildlife is diverse, so are our partners. We're working with people from around the world: Cambodia, Indonesia, Paraguay, Argentina, Vietnam, Madagascar, as well as those on the line today. So that cross-learning between participants of the Accelerator has been vital for getting new ideas out there. Finally, we're going to Alice in Brazil before we come to you with the Q&A. She is the project manager leading a set of innovations in a forest landscape where she works. And this is to ensure Brazil's Atlantic forest is standing and expanding into the future. And I've got a few questions for Alice, and then it's over to you in the audience to ask your questions to any of our landscape leaders and the forest team. So Alice, hi, how are you doing?
Hi, Katie, I'm fine, thank you. How are you?
Yeah, I'm fine. I'm enjoying this visit to all these different landscapes, but I can see that you're working, and I can see that you're working at home at the moment, but normally you're in the Atlantic forest. Many of us won't know about this forest. So where is it and why do you work there?
The Atlantic forest is located in South America, in parts of Brazil, Argentina, and Paraguay. And it is a beautiful region and home to many species which you can only find here and nowhere else in the world. Internationally, the forest is still lesser known than the Amazon. However, it's one of the most threatened forest ecosystems in the planet and one of the most biologically diverse. Unfortunately, here in Brazil, only about 12% of its original forest remains intact due to the historic exploitation of the Atlantic forest that started centuries ago. And also the largest cities of the country are located in this region, which means that 70% of the Brazilian population lives here, including myself. So this scenario led to severe fragmentation and habitat loss, which caused many species to become threatened with extinction and many that became extinct already. And this situation is even more intense in the Atlantic forest of northeastern Brazil. So this is what brought SAVE Brasil to work in this landscape called the Serra do Urubu-Murici corridor, as this is a high priority area for the conservation of birds.
Okay, so that's really interesting. And I think, like I said, as many of us won't know about the importance of the Atlantic forest, and it's clearly being lost fast. So why is that important to you, Alice?
Well, only in this specific region where we are working, there are more than 300 bird species, and 18 of them are threatened with extinction, which is a lot. And one of these endangered birds is the Alagoas antwern, which is a tiny gray bird, which you can see in Katie's screen. Thank you, Katie. And it is very mysterious and with a population of less than 30 individuals remaining in the world, and they can only be found in this place and nowhere else. And unfortunately, very recently, we saw 2 bird species vanish from this area. The cryptic tree hunter and the Alagoas foliage gleaner are now officially extinct. We might have arrived here too late for these 2 birds, but we can still do a lot to save the Alagoas entrant and many others from following the same fate. And one of the things we are doing to ensure this is working to recover its habitat in the Atlantic forest.
I see. Wow, and it's amazing to see your passion for this small but mysterious bird, which is small but an important part of our global ecosystem. So how are you and your team working in the Atlantic forest landscape?
So this landscape where we're working is a matrix of roads, small urban areas, pastures, farms, and only a few forest patches that are really like islands because of the fragmentation. However, there are many opportunities here too, as there are degraded lands, for example, from failed sugarcane business with high potential for a new model of agriculture mixed with forest conservation. So in this scenario, we are starting to work with the private landowners, as there is this huge restoration potential in their properties. And firstly, according to the Brazilian forest law, landowners have to leave 20% of their land for conservation, but in many cases they don't. So there is a deficit of 30,000 hectares only in this landscape, which should be forest. And secondly, these are two of the poorest states in Brazil, so we need to support people's well-being through a new, better model. And we want to encourage a new model of agroforestry and conservation, which, simply put, is a system that combines agriculture and animal farming with trees and includes revenue for keeping forests standing. So it brings a business case for restoration and conservation. We expect this to increase the livelihoods of local landowners with the production of fruits, timber, seeds, and roots.
Yeah, and so I can see that an investment in you is actually investment in a number of different opportunities. Like I can imagine it's like putting the pieces of a puzzle together, and I can see how important it is to work in all of those different pieces. And do you think with this approach, you will have the power to stop the deforestation in the Atlantic forest?
Yes, we do. By doing all these different things and with the support from BirdLife and also WWF Netherlands and Brazil, we are trying to assemble all these different pieces of the puzzle, which are preserving the forest and protecting biodiversity, increasing the connectivity between the forest patches, restoring forests, while offering new and alternative opportunities for the local community to increase their livelihoods by shifting to more sustainable farming practices. And other important pieces of the puzzle that also have to be considered are the local governments and other organizations that we are also engaging right now. And by working on this strategy, we do believe we can connect these forests and recover the habitat for the many different species that live there. We want to make sure that no other birds are going extinct in this region, and we really have to act now.
Yeah, thank you, Alice, for this final message. And we do really have to act now. And with this journey into different tropical forest landscapes, we hope you got an insight into the complexities, challenges, and opportunities that we all face, and how important it is to support local partners with local solutions. And finally, how the Accelerator landscape leaders are pushing a new, innovative future for forest conservation. So I don't know about you, but it's certainly convincing me. And in the words of the animation we heard earlier, landscapes are shaped by the decisions we make. So what's your next decision? And I'm going to pass over now to, I think Patricia is going to lead our Q&A and see what you'd like, how you're feeling about your exploration into tropical forest landscapes.
Well, thank you, Katie, and thank you, Alice and Gacheru, and by virtually in distance. And I know that our team in São Tomé is actually connected. I just saw a question from them. So thanks so much to Marquínha as well for taking the time and telling us the story of this fantastic place in Obo National Park in São Tomé Príncipe and the work that we're doing there. A lot of really interesting questions, and so it's going to be a little bit of a challenge here, but I think we have time. So I wanted to start with the forest-specific questions, and Gacheru, this is going to come to you, and Alice also to you. There was a question specifically about how we're selecting the tree, the types of trees and the species of trees that we're using. How are we making sure that we have enough seeds from those trees, and what are how are we making that part of the selection of the species work? So if you can, we can start there, and Alice, I'll go to you about biodiversity indicators.
Thank you, Patricia. The selection of the trees within our landscape is informed first by the science element. We are working very closely with the Kenya Forest Research Institute, who is a lead government agency mandated to research and provide input on which seeds and which trees to grow. And so for them, they are mandated to have the seeds and also propagate them on their laboratories. And then these seeds are also planted, are the ones which we use to plant, to propagate the seedlings. And also the community are also tasked and also trained to collect wildlings in the forests and propagate them in the same tree nurseries that they manage. So overall, for this site in Mount Kenya, all the trees that are grown within the site are indigenous to Mount Kenya and nowhere else within the mountains. So there's no external tree species that are brought in to Mount Kenya. So tree species like Junipera spocera, Olea africana, tree species like ficus, some ficus species, which are always propagated within and grown within the site. Thank you, Patricia.
Great. So Alisa, we were talking a little bit about birds that have gone extinct and that we may be too late for them, but we know that there's a series of different indicators that we use to check on the health of the forest, and a lot of those are really very good indicators are birds. So what are we using for the Atlantic forest, and how are you checking that our efforts are actually working?
Thank you, Patricia. This is a really good question, because this is something we always like to talk about in our projects. So as a BirdLife member, of course, we usually use birds as indicators because they're excellent indicators of forest quality and the habitat quality. So this is something we did in our reserve, because we have a private reserve inside this corridor located in Serra do Urubu, which is in the northern tip of the corridor. And we've had some amazing results using birds as indicators there. So we started a small restoration parcel inside our land, which is about 30 to 40 hectares. And right when we began the restoration, there were only about 3 species of birds, and they were all open area species. And 10 years later, we have over 70 different species in this same area. And we have endangered species, sensitive species, we have pollinizers, we have frugivorous species. So this shows that we were really able to improve the quality of this ecosystem. We were able to restore this ecosystem inside our reserve, and we intend to use the birds as indicators also in all the private properties that we aim to restore, because we want to see the same results. So we're going to do a lot of bird inventories and bird monitoring afterwards.
Great. So there's a question about the cost of restoring, and Katie, I may come into you as well, but how, maybe we go all through the 3 of you. What are we seeing the cost per hectare of restoration? Do we know those numbers?
If I may come in, Patricia. Thank you. Having modeled the different approaches of restoration, because majority of people only think that is only having the tree seedling and putting it on the ground, and it's on the cost of purchase. But there's cost of preparing that seedling from the seed to it being ready for planting, the transportation of that seedling from the tree nursery to the forest, the planting itself, the preparation of the site, the taking care of the seedling. At least for our case here in Kenya, we ensure that the seedlings are taken care of for at least for maximum of 3 years with active management of the site. And we have seen with that it costs between 70 cents US dollars to 100 to $1 per seedling. So it's 70 cents, so that's 70 shillings Kenya shillings to 100 Kenya shillings, because it also depends on the seedling and also how much effort is required in especially site preparation, and areas which have invasive plant species, the costs go higher because there's need for that active management of the site. Thank you.
Thanks, Gacheru. Alice, your thoughts from Brazil, how expensive it is to reforest in the Atlantic forest?
Very expensive, and we have a lot of variation, and in different regions of the Atlantic forest, we have completely different costs. If we think about the southeastern Atlantic forest and in the northeast, Right now, we're using our cost of an average $3,000 per hectare to restore an area. We will have areas that will be much cheaper, like if it's natural regeneration, for instance, but this is the average that we're using. That's what we're seeing right now.
And just to make things comparable, Gacheru, how many seedlings are we using in Kenya per hectare?
For us per hectare, we're using 1,000 seedlings, depending on average. So 1,000 seedlings times so it's like $1,000 per hectare on our end. But as Elisa says, it all depends with the site.
Yeah.
But at least in Mount Kenya, it's $1,000 per hectare for 3 years. Yes.
Katie, do we not have numbers of the other forest landscapes?
Well, I think you can see the variation there. So we actually go on a case-by-case basis based on the location and the types of restoration that are needed. And I think Elise's point, as well as Gacheru's, are both really important. As Elise said, the natural generation as well is a form of restoration that's potentially cheaper and works really well. You know, and there are all types of different types. We're seeing all types coming out in our landscape. So I can't give you an average figure, but yeah, to do a quality landscape restoration, it does cost. But we do think that there is great value for money coming from especially our Accelerator partners who are working on their business model.
So I'm going to put something that I'm going to put at the end as well. And this is, I mean, it's just to show you that this is not easy to do and it does require resources and it depends heavily on the place where we are. And there was a question about the role of protecting standing forest. And just so you guys know, we are doing a lot of that as well. But with your support and with your help, we can actually make a lot more of the restoration, particularly of these forests that are incredibly important for biodiversity, for not only bird species, but other species of creatures where we have not been able to protect that forest and that it needs to be restored. So I'm gonna put this down now, and I just want to go very quickly and confirm Gacheru and Elise, just a question about endemic and native species versus exotic species. We're not restoring with exotics, right, Gacheru?
We are not restoring forest with exotics. But one thing we are doing is encouraging the community, because one key thing of our area which is causing significant degradation is because of demand for fuel wood. And in my talk, I say that within these tree nurseries, there's also exotic species which are propagated. Those ones alone are only used for on-farm tree growing. So the community is able to have fuel wood for their own consumption at their household level. For the other indigenous species are all planted in the forest, but there also some people also want them to have them on their farm as well.
And Gacheru, before we go to Elise, just 1 second, you made a comment during your presentation about reforestation being repayable. Can we elaborate a little more on that? How are we making it repayable? Pay for itself.
So to pay for itself. So here we are modeling. We have quite a number of initiatives that would help for communities to be able to have back like incentives for them to be able to participate in forest restoration. The tree nursery itself is an incentive for them because it also generates income for the community. And I said last year alone, the community groups that you're working with earned around $190,000 from sale of tree seedlings, which was from people from within their landscape and also from people from outside their landscape, that people who want to grow trees. So, and given that they have the capacity to do that, that can be a business for them. In addition to that, there are other compatible forest land uses that are taking place within the forest. There is a bit, people are doing some beekeeping, and also others are also harvesting some seeds which are used for producing oil, especially from the croton species of trees. So this by itself is part of the incentives that you're trying to build up for the communities to be able to engage in forest restoration.
Great. Okay, Alicia, just tick confirmation native species. We're not putting exotics. Yes.
We're also restarting with native. Just a comment is that in the agroforestry units, we might use a few exotics.
But
depending on the commodities that we're going to assess are the most valuable.
Right. And so that's an excellent segue into working with communities and why it is important to figure out a composition of forest production in a way that is actually also supporting the community. So there were a couple of questions, one about how do we provide the incentives to communities so they can actually participate, and how do we make sure that they don't cut the trees afterwards? So who wants to come in first? Alisa, let's go ladies first.
Okay, sure. So this is always a challenge because we want to incentivize people to protect forests and to grow forests, but we never know how this is going to be in the long term. So this is why the mobilization and community engagement is so important, because we don't want people to just be doing it because we're telling them to do it. We want them to see the importance and we want them to get something positive from it. And we believe that if they are actually getting revenues from it, and they do get improvements in their livelihoods, they're gonna keep wanting to do this. Even if we're not there we will be there for a long time, but even if we're not there in a couple of years, they will still want to be doing it because it will be best for them.
Great. Gacheru?
So for us, as in addition to what Alicia said, we are working towards engaging the private sector because this community that we are supporting, we call them like stewards of the natural resource or the forest, and it's a voluntary service that they provide to the nation. But the private sector, the companies downstream, are making profits from the raw materials that come from the forest, especially water. So a key thing there is to provide a mechanism in which there can be benefit sharing between the companies and the communities upstream, so that then they ensure that the forests continuing producing the ecosystem services that goes downstream, in particular water, which is commonly used in the area. And with this, we are trying to use these lessons to inform government on the policy change or what policy needs to be made, and mostly angling towards like a payment for ecosystem services of some sort. But that has not been defined yet, but we are working towards getting some level of revenue sharing mechanism between the communities and private sector who benefit from the water which comes from the forest.
Yeah, so making sure that we are incentivizing and providing benefits to local communities is absolutely crucial, especially thinking about the future. There was a question about the timeline. What is the goal, say 50 years from now? Do we have an idea? And Katie, you may want to jump in with Trillion Trees now.
Yeah, that's a good one. So yeah, we have a goal. To mention Trillion Trees, this is a partnership between BirdLife International, WCS, and WWF UK. And as part of our partnership with them, this initiative is really looking to exponentially increase the amount of protection of standing forests and restoration of forests, and also stopping the drivers of deforestation. So also, just as Gacheru has said as well, looking at sectoral change, policy change. And that has an aim to restore 1 trillion trees over 50 years. And we're all very committed to that. And the Accelerator program is part of that, contributes to those numbers. So everyone's on that same journey, and we have to accelerate the results that we're getting. So everything that Gacheru and Alicia are working towards are proving that these models can work, and we can continue to accelerate them and reach the 1 trillion trees mission. I don't know if there's also Brina Griffin on the line. Maybe she wants to come in there.
Hello, I'm listening quietly. I didn't want to distract from the stars of this show, but yeah, so just to echo what Katie said, that's exactly right. So everything that we do for forests as BirdLife is contributing to this 1 trillion trees vision, and this idea that we really need to work together with other NGOs, but also within our teams and with all the other sectors to bring the kinds of sort of systematic changes that are needed to achieve a trillion trees vision by 2050. And as Katie said, it's really important to emphasize that that is both about protecting forests and keeping the forests that we have standing, as well as doing restoration. And restoration really works best when it's done in conjunction with protection of forests, so that we can have those native seedlings, as you guys have been discussing, and native forests expanding. So yeah, just to echo everybody's sentiments, this is all sort of leading towards that big vision that we would love all of you guys to be part of as well.
So before we move from you, Verena, and just one last question. Does a trillion trees equal $1 trillion?
Oh, that's a good question, actually. So I would say a trillion trees is probably more than $1 trillion. But I think, as Gacheru mentioned, that investment actually pays back in so many different ways. So I think we have to think of it not just as a cost. I think we have to think about it as an investment in our society and our sort of planetary health. And if you look at the numbers, really, and unfortunately I don't have them, sorry, Patricia, off the top of my head, but I think if you look at the numbers, they show that investment in ecosystems, and particularly in forests, actually have you know, a more than one-to-one return in terms of long-term benefits for people and climate. So so yes, probably more than $1 trillion, but it's worth it.
Yeah, and for those of you who have not participated on our green recovery webinars, we had an absolutely fantastic webinar. The first one with the multilaterals, where we had incredible numbers coming from both Europe and Latin America. We had Carlos Manuel Rodriguez, the now Chief Executive of the Global Environment Facility, but Minister of Environment until last Friday of Costa Rica. And he was saying that the investments that we're making on nature right now, that are around 80 billion US dollars, are absolutely nothing comparable to the investments that we're making on subsidies that are destroying nature, that are about $500 billion a year. So if we start thinking about changing the incentives and making sure that we're actually putting the money on what nature is actually providing to us, not only because of nature's sake, we will be able to see returns that are actually 8 times more than what we are actually getting from the subsidies that are actually destroying nature. So that's kind of those are the numbers that are floating right now. If you want to take a look on our YouTube channel, we have the links on the webinars. So incredibly important to think about incentives and policy. And there have been a couple of questions about how do we make sure that all of these initiatives are actually supported by policies that are going to help us maintain this forest standing and restoration continuing to go in the forests that we have destroyed in the future. How are we working with policymakers? Katie, can I start with you?
Yeah. So with policy, we work at different levels. And as kind of the animation says, you know, so many of the reasons why people make decisions in a landscape, it can be at a local level, national, global, and there are so many destructive policies out there. And I guess I hear lots of examples coming from the landscapes. Alicia, you have a really good one from Brazil. Just to start to say that the reason why I think it's really important there is that with the support of the Accelerator, you've been able to get this kind of legal technical advice that's helped you put an argumentation to the state government for policy change. And I think that things like that are actually that kind of technical advice, and how we actually engage with all of these different levels of policy often aren't part of, you know, anyone's business plan, or they're not part of any kind of, you know, costing that we've done at the beginning of the year, but we have to react and take advantage of opportunities like that. And I think, Alicia, do you want to expand on that a bit? Because I find that one a really interesting topic.
Sure. So we have 2 policies here in Brazil that help us with that. One is the Brazilian forest law that I mentioned in my conversation with Katie, which makes properties, the landowners have to set aside at least 20% of their lands in the Atlantic forest for you, either you have to preserve the forest that you already have, or you have to restore it if you don't. And there is a huge deficit, as I mentioned, because only in this landscape, 30,000 hectares that should be forests are not, and they should be, to be according with the law, they should be. So this is something that we have because the law mandates that people have to preserve this. So we want to help these people comply because we want to help them preserve what they already have and restore. And something else that Katie mentioned is there is an incentive in Brazil where the municipalities, they receive an extra revenue every year according to the amount of protected areas that there are inside the municipality's limits. So in the municipality where we are working, the only revenue they get from it is because our reserve exists. So only by our reserve being inside the municipality, they get around $10,000 each year. So this is something that we can work as an investment because if the municipalities can incentivize other landowners to create reserves, then they can actually get revenue from it.
Yeah, and thinking about using public funds to incentivize not only restoration at the level that we are doing, but also natural regeneration and enabling stewards of forest lands that can regenerate themselves. Again, there was an example that I heard about when I was in Davos in January about how the payment for ecosystem services and the recognition of forest lands in Costa Rica ended up creating more forest cover and generating income for local people. So we are on...
Can I add something real quick, Patricia? Is that okay?
Please.
Yeah, so I just wanted to add something about the private sector, because I think at the moment we're in, and this came up in the example from Kenya as well, at the moment we're in right now, we're seeing a massive change in the attitudes of the private sector. And so I'm sure many people have seen companies making a lot of commitments to their climate strategies and to ending deforestation. And so I think we can't underestimate the importance of that in terms of both their own internal policies and the work that they're doing, but the influence that private sector has on public policy. Because we've seen in some places where the private sector is actually pushing for more regulation or pushing for clarity of regulation because they want to make these commitments. And in order to level the playing field between individual companies or within a sector, it makes more sense to have some kind of regulation around certain topics around deforestation or climate. And so actually, I think we're in a really interesting moment where the policy isn't just government regulating, but it's actually a sort of exchange between the private sector showing some leadership and the public sector kind of beginning to sort of respond to that. And I think over the next couple of years, that will be a really important part of policy making, which is exciting.
Yeah, and I think that speaks to why is the private sector and the companies upstream also benefiting from this, and why are they interested? What has changed? And I think it's incredibly important to remember that there has been a really big push on using forest restoration and forest conservation as a nature-based solution for climate change. And that's something that we have been heavily advocating from the BirdLife family all throughout, not only from the Global Secretariat, but from all the BirdLife partners that are working directly with their governments, and they are delegations to the UNFCCC and the discussions that they are having around the climate convention. So, Brina, before I let you go, why do you think this? What is the incentive? Why are private companies becoming more interested in this?
So I think there's a couple of reasons. I think, as Gacheru mentioned, I think we are doing, as a conservation community, doing a better job at explaining why ecosystem services and ecosystem integrity is important for the business model and for the economy. And I think people are starting to understand that and genuinely see risks at ecosystem loss and see that as a business risk. I also think that the public, and this is in large part due to the conservation community, been sort of waving the flag for many, many years, are starting to sort of realize that and put pressure on the private sector. And I also think that individually, people within those companies believe it. And so when you go to work, you want to go to work in a company that you see is doing good as well as making a lot of money. I think increasingly that's going to be a really important piece is that companies want their own employees to feel proud about what the company is doing. And so I think all of those things are kind of happening at the same time and leading to that change.
Great. Let's go back a little bit into the policy and governance and land tenure. How critical it is for these projects to be successful, to have clarity on land tenure, and for communities to have clarity on their land tenure. Alice, let's start with you.
Very important. It's really important. And one of the reasons is the Brazilian forest law, because something that comprises the law is that all landowners, they have to register the land in the system, and it's self-declaratory. So they get to sign which parts of the property are the permanent protected areas, which are the gallery forests. So it's really important that they have land tenure to do so. So to comply, we need to have this really cleared out. And it can be an issue in Brazil, in this region.
Agreed. Gacheru, how are you guys dealing with that in Kenya?
So here in Kenya, we are lucky, we're a bit lucky with our government recognizing the need for integrating communities in forest restoration. So in Mount Kenya, the government has entered into agreements with communities for them to participate in forest restoration. And this is anchored within the Forest and Conservation Act of the country, where there is community forest associations who actively engage in forest restoration. So that is in government forests. And then off the government forests, there is also movements towards supporting elements of what you call like climate smart agriculture, agroforestry programs within private lands. But within this, there's no law that defines, say, that you have to have this number of trees on your land, but you're encouraged to have those practices so that you can conserve your soils and you can ensure that you also have your own fuel wood on your land as well. And there is a law also on cutting down a tree. You have to go to the local chief to get a license to cut a tree. So within those mechanisms themselves, they have helped in increasing tree cover within our country on private lands, but also helping in co-management of the government land.
Yeah, and it is incredibly important, especially for the security of the communities and for them to feel that they can be part of a project. So there's a very interesting question about how do we select the communities? Is it that it's based on the area that we want to work on, or how do we go about it? Elise?
Sure. So this is a good part of the work, because we're getting to this stage and we are going to identify the communities through the mobilization. And unfortunately, due to the pandemic, we had to stop right when we were about to start, we had to stop. But something that we were considering when we first planned the project, we were considering priority areas. So we were going to identify priority areas for restoration. But after we had a workshop with many stakeholders that helped us discuss and think of this plan, then we came to a conclusion that we shouldn't consider priority areas, because many of these areas are in places that cannot be restored due to a huge amount of issues, including land tenure. So we decided to think of potential areas. And this is going to include communities that are interested in it and communities that want to seize this opportunity. So this is something new that we are considering right now, and will be an important criteria for us to choose the communities that we're going to work with.
Gacheru, your thoughts?
For us, we prioritized the ecosystem that we wanted to work in, and when we selected Mount Kenya was due to be able to develop this model and also provide facts for our policymakers that if you do not do conservation or you don't manage this our forest landscape well, we have the economic impact with it. So Mount Kenya provided a good opportunity for us to demonstrate this, and we started this around 6 years ago, and with the lessons that are being generated, this is informing policymakers on changing this. And then within that landscape, we started small with 2 community groups identified under the Forest Act, who are co-managers of the forests. and providing the incentives for them to be able to actively carry out forest restoration. And now we have scaled that up to 28 groups around the forest. So we started small steps. In 2016, we went to 6 groups. In 2017, we went to 22 groups. And now in 2019, 2020, we are moving on to 28 groups and providing these lessons for upscaling.
When we are engaging communities, there's also the potential challenge of displacing them. And I know that BirdLife is incredibly, and the BirdLife partners are incredibly careful about making sure that we are empowering and incorporating and integrating communities into the solutions that we are putting in place. But there is a question from Jean-Baptiste about isn't there the risk to displace communities because of deforestation and or degradation? Brina, should I shoot that one to you?
Sure. I mean, I guess there's, I'm not sure whether Jean-Baptiste is referring to displacement because of conservation activities or displacement because of ecosystem degradation. So I guess the first one is more about sort of ensuring the practices that we take on the ground in terms of ensuring that if we're advocating for example, legal protection of a forest, that the land tenure issues are clear and that and that we're not sort of advocating for land to be taken away from communities. And that's, you know, it's very specific to particular places and how the dynamics work. And, you know, but as you said, BirdLife is very, very careful about that, and sort of community empowerment is built into what we do. And we have a number of sort of policies and guidance for partners on working with communities. So that wouldn't happen. In terms of displacement because of deforestation and degradation, I think this is another interesting one, because while in many places deforestation is, particularly in Africa, is still the majority of deforestation is happening because of small scale agriculture. So individual communities sort of expanding farms and chipping away at farms, chipping away at the forest. In other places, deforestation is caused by large-scale industrial agriculture. So what we're seeing in places like in the Amazon is that deforestation is actually caused by the same cause as displacement of people. And so by advocating to keep forests intact, we're actually also helping communities maintain their land rights. And so kind of there's two potential issues there, but I think looking at where communities want to stay in the forest and want to be able to sustainably manage them, and helping them do that instead of losing their land to, you know, large scale clearing is something that, you know, is a really important part of our work in some places.
And there is a very strong linkage to indigenous lands and indigenous people.
Right. Yeah.
So there was a question about the role that indigenous people play and how can we use this opportunity as an empowerment, especially considering that in many cases indigenous lands are still in very good shape. So how are we working about this? And Katie, maybe we can talk about some of the other landscapes.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of a good example. I mean, this is always a question that comes up when you're working at a landscape level. And when we talk about stakeholders, community groups are a really big, important stakeholder, and they need to have a seat at the table when any kind of consultations, any kind of negotiations are going on. And that's something that we always promote with all of the landscapes that we work with, and all the landscape leaders are in agreement that this is the best way to work. And if you have that joined up conservation and production landscape vision, and everyone is bought into it, then you're going to have a much fairer outcome at the end of it. So I can bring an example from Indonesia and our BirdLife partner there, Burung Indonesia, and they have worked at this landscape level. So they have conservation agreements with the villages that they work with that are dotted around and within the protected areas. And again, it's this mosaic idea. So you have patches of some kind of activity going on, and then you have protected areas, and then you have agriculture that's agroforestry, so it's productive, but it's also bringing in a upper canopy of shade trees that can actually connect different fragments of forest over, and there you've got biodiversity moving in a much larger area, which is much better for ecosystems. So just by having those agreements and starting those conversations at a village level, they've been able to build out a much bigger plan that involves everyone. So the businesses as well have to be part of this plan. They decide also where they are going to do their planning, and that's in conjunction with the villages that either own the land or live on the land. Whichever 10-year system you have to figure out those dynamics. So for me, that's a really good example. They've also set up business units so that the villages can own small companies, because of course with smallholder farmers, often they'll have smaller production volumes at the end of the season, but if you bring everything together, you can get a much better price and you can lower your transport costs by working in a cooperative manner. So that's something as well that they've done, and by setting up these business units, they're actually making more money and bringing all of the crops together, cutting the transport costs, and also getting a higher price at the end of it because they're working in this cooperative structure. So I think for me, they're really inspiring, because what Burung Indonesia are doing, and what all, same with Gacheru and Alice, they are trying to hit all of these different things that make up a landscape. They're looking at policy, smallholders, big companies, local government, and also global sectoral changes, and trying to bring that all together in a landscape approach. And we've seen that to be really effective, because it makes sure that communities have a seat at the table in all of those negotiations. And of course, it's a really big challenge. Please, everyone else, jump in. That's just one of, there's so many inspiring examples of how it's done.
Who wants to jump in?
Yeah.
Well, I was just going to say, I think to that point, I think, the issues with Indigenous rights are really key, but in many of the landscapes we work in, the communities that we're working with are not necessarily sort of classified as Indigenous communities, but they are communities that have a very long history in that area. And so, I think from our perspective on the ground, we consider all the stakeholders and the role that they play in those landscapes as important. And so those communities that are, the smallholder communities or the Indigenous communities, they're all sort of different. As Katie said, they're in that landscape. They are stakeholders who have rights and have a say in how the future of the landscape.
So let me ask you about the role of the youth. How have we engaged youth champions? Are we doing that? How are we doing it? Gacheru, I want to start with you.
Yes, thank you, Patricia. The youth are a core part of our restoration work, and here mainly working with the local schools within the landscape that you're working in. Here in Mount Kenya, we are engaging a couple of schools, and we also have a community group with an education resource center, where they use that resource center to educate over 28 schools which are around them. And recently, looking at the elements of fuel wood consumption, because the same schools have a feeding program and they use fuel wood for cooking. So we have worked with partners where we have supported them with energy-saving cook stoves that have reduced fuel wood consumption to over 70%. With the same amount of fuel wood, they can use it 3 or 4 times for cooking. And those ones are being used, like we're calling them climate smart schools, and they're model schools within that landscape where schools are coming to learn and seeing how then they can engage in forest conservation. Another approach is the group, like here in Kenya, we have banned use of plastic bags. Some of the schools have come up to start collecting waste bottles, waste Tetra Pak containers for milk, etc., and using them as potting materials for establishment of their own small tree nurseries. So we're seeing by itself, it has its own, the youth are building up their own interest in forest restoration and using them as, and using the education system. I think we're building up a good next generation for who would engage in forest restoration.
Yeah. So I want to make sure that we cover a couple of other complicated issues. Financing. So there's a question about whether we have done carbon and how we're thinking about how are we resolving that investment on clarifying land tenure, which is a very expensive one in some cases. What is the financing model? How are we thinking about this? We talked a little bit about this with the accelerator, but Brina, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I can touch on carbon and then Katie can talk about sort of other types of financing. So on carbon, we are actively exploring carbon as a financing source for forest landscapes. We have a couple of examples in the sort of BirdLife family already, 1 or 2 projects in Paraguay that have been going for quite a while and 1 in Sierra Leone. And the sort of standards and process for developing a forest carbon project have been evolving over time. And so I think the baseline for us is that if we develop a carbon project, we want it to be the best carbon project we can develop, which means that we're looking for the best set of standards, including sort of additional community and biodiversity standards, which are kind of globally recognized. And it does cost a lot of money. I mean, developing a carbon project requires developing essentially a governance structure in that landscape, a formalized governance structure, as the participant mentioned, clarifying land tenure, clarifying ownership. There's a lot of legal and financial pieces to it, as well as actually doing the conservation work you need to show that you've reduced the deforestation. So they are pretty big undertakings, but we are seeing a real interest in buying those high quality carbon credits with multiple benefits for people and biodiversity. And so we're getting a lot of interest from companies, from the private sector, from project developers to work with us to do that. So we're really excited about that. And we're actively developing, we're doing feasibility studies right now on a couple of places. And these are places where we've worked for a long time. So we're not just sort of starting a project from scratch. These are landscapes like where Elise works and like where Gacheru works, where we've worked and our partners have worked for a very long time. So we know these places and we've assessed that it's a potential. And so hopefully over the coming year, we'll be able to sort of move forward and potentially in 18 months to 2 years, maybe we'll have some new carbon credits. But yeah, if anyone's interested in that work, I'm happy to take additional questions or people can get in touch with us to find out more. Katie, I don't know if you want to talk about other types of financing.
Oh yeah, I mean, I can just mention that we're looking at, just as we keep saying about landscapes, you have to interact with all different levels, and it's the same with finance. So there are so many opportunities and ways to go, but what we find, and the gap that we're trying to close, is that there's actually a load of green finance sloshing around at the moment, being offered, being pledged. And what we find actually is that many of our BirdLife partners, who are local organizations really working with communities, often at smaller scales, can't access such big finance. So we think through the Accelerator, and that means bringing all of these different landscapes. We have 10 landscapes so far in our portfolio, and we think by doing an Accelerator portfolio we can actually bring the power of many and actually start to tap into these really big ideas and these really big finance that's around at the moment. And just to give an idea, it's in the multi-millions or more in green finance, and what we really need from that is a mechanism that allows us to draw down slowly on it, have a favorable turn. It needs to be slow finance so that we can build it up over time. And we see something like, of course, grants and offers from donors and everything that we have is so important to get us to this point, and really important during COVID, for example, because it's really helped us to maintain and keep going. But over time, we want to start to move to more sustainable sources. And that's what, what Gacheru and Alice have been talking about. So these repayable options, it is a business model. It keeps working on its own. And over time, we'll be progressing to that. And when we get to that stage, we believe that we'll be in a really strong position to be able to tap into all these opportunities. And that's when we talk about investment. So we want people to invest and see a conservation return on investment. And we do think that has a lot of potential, especially as Brina has mentioned as well, that is the way that the economy, and that's the way that corporates are going. They want to be able to make these big pledges and move in a better direction. So we want to be ready to work with them on that.
Anyone else wants to jump on finance before I change gears a little bit?
If I may say something, Patricia, is in our country, financing, especially working closely with the local community groups, we are finding, as Katie has alluded to, a disconnect between the capacity of the local groups to be able to handle finance from big institutions. And what Nature Kenya has done here, and the reason why I mentioned that in my talk, is we are marketing these groups, these community groups, to big companies here in Nairobi and across the country. And we mainly act just as an intermediary. All the financing goes to the community, with Nature Kenya providing them safety or financial prudence that these financiers require, because the communities don't have tax exemption, etc. Those things which require a big company to have. But then institutions like us, we're able to bridge that gap for them, and therefore draw from these companies through Nature Kenya to the groups. And then we provide that conduit. Then the company is able to move from their offices to the sites and participate in actual restoration and actually see where their money is going. But then the returns of forest restorations are not immediate. When you talk about water replenishment, carbon, etc., you'll not see them next year. You'll see them maybe in 30 years' time. But if they get in and entrench this in their sustainability programs, then I think it will be, like what Brina said, it will provide a basis for them to continually engage in restoration initiatives.
Yeah, it's a safety net, isn't it? Alisa, anything on finance before I switch gears?
No, please go ahead. I think they've got it all covered.
I will stress, though, that the role of with all of these new models that we're creating, the role of the donor community is still there, and everybody can play a role. Little, small, big, anything, we all have the power to change. And by contributing and supporting all these fantastic projects that BirdLife is, the BirdLife family is putting in place, you are helping us to move the needle. All right, we have 10 minutes and I have a couple of really interesting questions, so hopefully we'll be able to cover them. One specific one is about working with other conservation organizations. And Trillion Trees is a big example of that. But I also want to get Gacheru and Alice to tell us a little more about how you guys, as representatives of the BirdLife family in your own country, work with other organizations at the local level. And there was a mention about the botanical garden in São Tomé, for example, but local organizations in Kenya, local and international organizations in Brazil. How are we making that happen? We know that this is a problem that is a lot bigger than even BirdLife, that is the biggest partnership for nature. How are we connecting with others, learning from others, sharing our experience with others? Gacheru, can I start with you?
Yes, so in our country, we have our conservation community here has come together and formed like national bodies and also site-based bodies where we share lessons. So in our country, we have an umbrella conservation body, which we call Conservation Alliance. And then within Nature Kenya, that we have championed over time, and we have a National Liaison Committee where we bring all these conservation agencies and conservation NGOs to the same table to discuss conservation work and seeing how best we can merge together and synergize our effort. In Mount Kenya, we have the restoration strategy, which all the conservation agencies within that whole landscape contributed to, and they have adopted it for implementation. So overall is seeing how best we can synergize with our groups, and we are seeing already that happening within our country, between Nature Kenya, WWF Kenya, TNC, etc. within this country. Thank you.
Thanks, Gacheru. Alisa?
We've been having such a good experience in working with other organizations, especially with this project, because now we have so many more people aboard that we didn't have like 1 or 2 years ago. So now we have, thanks to a big donation from WWF Netherlands, we have the support and partnership from WWF Brazil, and they've been working closely with us since the beginning of the year, a bit of last year too. And this has been of great help. Because of this, we've also been able to engage other organizations, such as a local one called CEPAN, which also works in the same region and with restoration. So we share the same objectives. So we're doing so many things together now. And thanks to this partnership with WWF, now we're also part of an alliance in Brazil called the Pact for the Restoration of the Atlantic Forest. And this organization is now really involved with this project. And it's something that we're also helping them, we're helping each other, because they were not acting in this region. They had a lot of actions in the Atlantic forest in the south and southeastern Brazil, but they were not in the northeast, and now they're there too. And this is so important because we were able to bring these important organizations to work there with us.
Brina, can we talk a little bit more about Trillion Trees and how did that come about and how is it working?
Sure. So Trillion Trees was launched in 2016, at the end of 2016. And as we mentioned, it's BirdLife, the Wildlife Conservation Society, which is a New York-based but global organization, and WWF UK, but bringing in sort of the larger WWF family as well. And the idea is that we, inherently we realized that we could do more together. So we would have a stronger voice speaking on forest issues, thinking about what we call the imperatives, which is to end deforestation, better protect forests, and advance restoration. All of those things, if we could all be speaking that same language, we would have a much greater impact working together. And over the past few years, we've begun to develop joint activities. And I think we are doing some things on the ground, as Elise mentioned, with WWF and BirdLife and SAVE Brasil, BirdLife partner. But even more, I think one of the things that the partnership enables us is this joint learning and initiatives where we were all doing a few things on a particular theme, but didn't actually get to a critical mass. But by working together on that theme, we actually can advance it. So for instance, around carbon or around sustainable finance or things like that, where we're in a very early stage and we all have a lot to learn and we all have a lot of work to do. And so by working together, we can actually do more than we would be able to do independently. And interestingly, we've recently started sort of referring to the partnership as a joint venture, because we actually see it as the three organizations investing in Trillion Trees together, and then that Trillion Trees being able to kind of have a life of its own in a way, in that it can act and it can, invest in things and invest in new science, invest in particular initiatives as Trillion Trees. So I'm really excited. We've recently brought on a new executive director for Trillion Trees. He joined this month. So we're really excited to kind of work even more. And we've recently been able to raise some additional funding, which is going to enable us to kind of ramp up our activities together. So it is really great, and Trillion Trees is actually what enabled us to launch the Accelerator last year. It's enabled a number of other of our major initiatives, including some of the work that we're doing on carbon. So it's really been a massive sort of value for BirdLife, and also BirdLife brings to Trillion Trees all of that science, all of the 120 partners working around the world, that like local credibility. So yeah, I'm really, really excited about sort of Trillion Trees and working with those partners and identifying that real kind of synergy, as Gacheru said, where you know, what can we do together that we couldn't do separately? That's the real important part.
Yeah, and I think it's a fantastic example of something that the conservation community has not done enough, which is working together. Yeah. The problem is so much bigger than any of us, and unless we actually join forces and put the shoulder and really identify how can we complement each other, which we can, we will not be able to make it. Okay, we have 3 minutes, and there are a couple of topics that I'm not going to be able to cover. There's a big discussion about tourism that I'm going to put it offline, and I'm really sorry, I really wanted to get into that. But I want to talk about COVID. I want you guys to tell me, what have you seen the impact of COVID has been so far? Do you see the light at the end of the tunnel? Do we really have hope? Where do you see things coming? And I will close with a comment about that. Alice, you want to come first?
Yeah, sure. I'll go quick so everyone has time. So we've been heavily impacted, especially regarding mobilization, because as I said, we were about to start. And with this situation, we can't go around visiting people from the communities because we don't want to bring the disease to them, and we don't want our team to get sick either. So this has been the highest impact because we're used to doing everything with people, and now we can't do anything with people. But we definitely see a light in the end of the tunnel, because we think that maybe this year things will still be complicated, but by the beginning of next year, we think we'll be able to resume visits and do things with the communities again. Maybe even this year, we can resume some visits following a very strict health protocol though.
Gacheru?
In addition to what Alicia said, on our side, we have observed private sector pulling off resources and putting it through to the health sector, where we were engaging companies here, and they said, now this year we are not going to finance this. We are putting this, supporting the government to do the response to COVID, especially putting money into the health sector. And this by itself has, we don't know what that would have, what impact that would have in our restoration work. But if you project and it happens for the next 2 years, there will be a big gap in continuing restoration initiative within our country. But we hope that this can be bridged with other alternative resourcing, which might come from other places. Thank you.
Great. And Katie, you want to jump in before I go? Quickly.
Okay, quickly. Just to say that that's something all of the landscapes we work with are reporting. Divergence of funding and operations being really difficult, and as a result we will see a knock-on effect, and there will likely be higher deforestation rates, so we do have to try and find ways to make this work over the next 6 months, and then there's a light at the tunnel, hopefully.
And I do want to emphasize what I was talking about before. I do believe that we have the huge opportunity for a green recovery. Please keep joining us on our webinars. The banner that I have behind me about our campaign on One Planet, One Right is the champion of that green recovery, is making sure that we can have the right to a healthy environment as a fundamental human right. We're campaigning for that, so join us. We just passed the 70,000 mark, so we have had 70,000 signatures already, which is great. But also join us and support us, and share the information that you are seeing on the webinar with your friends and colleagues. We all can make a difference. As I said before, we all have the opportunity of changing the way that things are happening. So go to our donor box. That's the link right there. Thanks so much for your support and for joining us. It's been lovely to have you. Thank you so much, Alisa. Thank you so much, Gacheru. Katie and Brina, fantastic job from you guys on the forest work. And thank you to the São Tomé team. Jean-Baptiste, if you can say to Marquínha that we love the video and that she is a star. And we look forward to seeing you guys soon. We will have another green recovery webinar by the end of August, so stay tuned when we will bring in youth leaders to talk about and demand a green recovery. And then we will have a public webinar on conservation on vultures at the beginning of September. So thanks so much for joining us. Sorry for not covering all of the fantastic questions, but we loved having you, and stay tuned, visit our website and be part of the family. Join us, support us. Thank you so much for everything, guys, and have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you, guys.